Tropical storm Sanba triggered landslides and flooding in the South Philippines with heavy rain and winds. At the time of this recording, at least 10 people are reported to have died. It made landfall in the country on Tuesday, February 13th, and was projected to make its way west. Disaster relief officials said most of the deaths were reported in the Surigao del Sur and Surigao del Norte provinces. About 5 people died in Carasal and 1 child in the Leyte province from landslides. The nation's Weather Bureau estimated the winds reaching up to 65 kilometers an hour. The Philippine Coast Guard reported hundreds of passengers are stranded in the Visayas and Mindanao. According to the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council, the storm has affected about 5,000 families as of Thursday. Sanba is estimated to have left the Philippines by Friday. For United News International in Metro Manila, I am Crystal Yap.
Mount Agung on the island of Bali erupted again after weeks of being in a state of rest. The Indonesian National Board of Disaster Management said the volcano erupted on Tuesday, February 13th at 11:49 a.m. local time. A cloud of smoke and ash reached as high as 1.5 kilometers. A spokesperson for Bali's disaster agency confirmed the eruption lasted more than 2 minutes and didn't cause disruptions. Flights in and out of the island of Bali were unaffected at the time of this recording. Mount Agung erupted in November last year for the first time since 1963. The highest threat level was lowered in early February, and residents living in danger zones were told they could return home. The volcano status is now at level 3, or standby. Residents have not been told to evacuate, but are cautioned to stay 4 kilometers away from Agung's crater. For United News International, I'm Cambry Caldwell.
This flu season could break records in the United States. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is tracking a sharp rise in hospitalizations that shows no signs of leveling off. According to CDC data, the flu hospitalization rate per 100,000 people is already at 60. That's close to the peak from 2014-15, the worst flu season in recent memory. Acting CDC Director Ann Schuchat says 1 out of every 10 Americans who died last week died from the flu or pneumonia. She's asking anyone who's sick to stay home from work. Many folks are doing so. In fact, so many that it could take a toll on productivity. Outplacement firm Challenger Gray & Christmas has crunched the numbers behind the CDC data. Based on an estimate of 18 million employees missing 4 days of work, it says this flu season could cost the economy $15.4 billion in lost output. For United News International, I'm Matt Paul.
Desperate refugees outside Jakarta's immigration detention center. Families with small children, even newborns, are camping outside the gate, hoping to be let in. Many of them have skin problems. Sabihullah Nazari is from Afghanistan. He says after 4 years in Indonesia, he has lost hope any country will accept him and his family. Money provided by his family back home has run out.
We ask from them, just put us in prison, but give us the food, give us the floor to sleep, give us something that we should not be under the rain, under the sun.
Indonesia is not a signatory to the UN Convention on Refugees. Many use the country as a transit point to go to Australia or to be resettled in the United States or Europe. But more than 14,000 have been stuck here after most countries closed their borders. Zari Jafari was 7 when she arrived in Indonesia. 4 years ago, she and her family barely survived the journey when their boat sank.
Our money had finished, so my father can't support us, so I can't study, so that's why we are sleeping in the road.
But immigration officials say they can't let the refugees in. The detention center is already overcrowded.
Inside the detention center, conditions are even more grim. More than 300 refugees have been detained in a place with a capacity of only 100. Cramped together in these small rooms, many have fallen ill. Refugees who have been waiting for many years to be resettled to another country have now become prisoners in Indonesia.
Many refugees hope international organizations will take care of them as soon as they are detained. But the UN Agency for Refugees, the UNHCR, says there's not enough money to help all the refugees stuck in Indonesia. Increasingly, some have decided to return to their home country instead. Last year, 400 returned to Afghanistan, although the UNHCR says the country is not safe.
Not from our perspective, but if refugees are willing to go, if they decide that it's safe enough for them to go back home, we wouldn't stop them. Certainly there are refugees that have returned back to Afghanistan from various countries.
But it's a desperate attempt because they have no other option left.
I can't make that decision for anyone. It is a decision that every refugee makes for themselves.
While the Indonesian government says it's looking for a solution for these stranded refugees, people from the neighborhood are providing them with water, food and medical help. But their numbers are increasing, and it will be hard for volunteers to continue to support them. Step Vassen, Al Jazeera, Jakarta.
War destroys lives, it traumatizes communities. And in many of the world's conflict zones, children are suffering the most. This is eastern Ghouta, a suburb of the Syrian capital Damascus last week. It's faced relentless bombardment after years of starve and surrender tactics. The human rights group Save the Children believes youngsters in war zones are now more at risk than at any time in the past 20 years. According to a new report by the organisation, 1 in 6 of the world's children live in conflict zones. That's 357 million children, a 75% increase since the early 1990s. Syria, Afghanistan and Somalia are the 3 most dangerous conflict-affected countries to be a child. In the past few years, there's been a 300% increase in UN-verified cases of killing and maiming of children. And around half of all children in conflict zones lack access to schools and health facilities. Many of these children in the Democratic Republic of Congo's Kasai region count violence among their earliest memories. Militia have destroyed schools and homes across the region, and the UN says thousands of children have been forced to become soldiers. Save the Children's one of several organisations trying to rehabilitate victims.
The things we're talking about in this report are children being raped, children being forced to fight, children being forced to kill other children, horrifying brutality. And so there's a number of things we can do. We can invest better in mental health and psychosocial support for children in disaster zones. We can rebuild the society around them, get them back into school, reunite them with their families. There's a whole range of things we can do, but that does take investment, it takes time and it takes support.
Despite greater international standards when it comes to protecting children, increasingly brutal tactics are being employed. The widespread use of indiscriminate weapons, cluster and barrel bombs have seen child casualty numbers soar. This 9-year-old Rohingya girl was shot 3 times whilst fleeing Myanmar. Children are not simply caught in the crossfire, they are targets. Aid groups say the profound psychological impact of conflict on children cannot be underestimated. There are things seen in childhood that can take a lifetime to recover from. Neve Barker, Al Jazeera.
A gunman opened fire on a Florida high school, killing at least 17 people. The Broward County Sheriff's Office arrived at Stoneman Douglas High School February 14th to find hundreds of students streaming out of the building. They were fleeing a gunman armed with a AR-15, a semi-automatic rifle. The sheriff's office has identified him as 19-year-old Nicholas Cruz, a former student who was expelled from the same school last year. Cruz had a troubled past, and his social media profiles were rife with images of knives and guns that Sheriff Scott Israel described as, quote, very, very disturbing. Israel is now pleading with the public to immediately report suspicious activities because it could help to prevent another major tragedy. 15 victims died at the school, 2 others died at the hospital. Cruz has already been charged with 17 counts of premeditated murder. For United News International in Washington, D.C., I'm Caitlin Mangum.
The Turkish Armed Forces TAF and the Free Syrian Army FSA captured the village of Qud from YPG forces in the Afrin area. Separately, reports appeared that the TAF and the FSA had deployed additional troops and equipment west of the Jandaris district, indicating the upcoming offensive there. Pro-YPG sources said that Kurdish forces had repelled Turkish attacks in the districts of Raja and Bulbul. Over 20 Turkish-backed fighters were reportedly killed there. Both the Syrian army and the US-backed forces are reportedly massing troops and fortifying their positions in the Euphrates Valley. According to pro-opposition and pro-government sources, the sides are preparing for possible skirmishes in the area. ISIS captured Haifa Street from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham HTS and its allies in the center of Yarmouk refugee camp in southern Damascus. Separately, the terrorist group also attacked HTS positions in the western part of the camp but failed to gain any ground. 4 ISIS members were reportedly killed. February 10 Israeli airstrikes took out nearly half of the Syrian air defenses. The Israeli newspaper Haaretz reported on February 14, citing senior Israeli Defense Force officials. The sources considered the operation a success, even despite the fact that the F-16I had been shot down. On the same day, the Russian media provided another look at the story, citing Syrian and Russian military sources. According to this version, Syrian forces shot down 13 of 18 Israeli air-launched cruise missiles during the encounter, additionally to the F-16I. On February 14, Ali Akbar Velayati, the top advisor to Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, called on the U.S. to withdraw its troops from Syria, describing its presence as illegal. The statement was a response to earlier remarks by U.S. State Secretary Rex Tillerson, who argued that the Iranian presence is destabilizing the situation in the country. The diplomat also rejected an idea that the U.S. lacks influence in Syria, saying that Washington and the coalition forces control a large part of the country's oil fields and about 30% of its territory. Considering the current attitude of the sides, it is hard to expect that any kind of comprehensive diplomatic solution of the crisis could be found soon.
There's a saying, you dance with the ones who brought you. In Manbij, Syria, the U.S. military is supporting the Syrian Defense Forces, local fighters who helped liberate the city from ISIL. Just one problem. The SDF is led by Kurds, whom Turkey considers a mortal enemy. Ankara once again is demanding Washington abandon the SDF and pull its own forces out of Syria.
Why are you standing around? Go ahead and leave. Who did you bring there? The YPG? YPG? PKK? You take them there, and you are still telling us not to come to Manbij. We will come to Manbij to deliver the land to its true owners.
The U.S. response? Not happening.
We need to stay here until that political environment is stable, and our security here, our presence here, provides that level of stabilization. It brings security.
Manbij will be at the top of the agenda when U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson meets with Turkish officials. And it's just the latest in a number of issues that have driven Ankara and Washington apart, going back to the start of the Syrian civil war in 2011.
Turkey became increasingly frustrated that the United States wasn't helping it achieve its goal of bringing down Assad, and the United States became increasingly frustrated by Turkey's support for radical groups.
What's more, the U.S. is still refusing to extradite the cleric Fethullah Gulen, accused of plotting the failed 2016 coup against Erdogan. All this has the Turkish president jockeying for closer ties with Russia and attacking the U.S. as a proto-enemy everywhere he goes. The anti-American message is resonating. A recent poll found that 79% of Turks hold an unfavorable view of the U.S. government. Just 18% have a favorable view. Even people-to-people ties are affected. 67% of Turks have an unfavorable view of Americans. U.S. officials say Tillerson knows he will be having difficult conversations when he and Turkish leaders sit down. But they insist he won't be giving the Turks what they really want: an end to the U.S. presence in Manbij and support for the fighters who retook it from ISIL. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Lasers may become a common weapon in the U.S. Navy's arsenal in the not-so-distant future. The Navy recently revealed that it is working on 4 separate laser-based weapon systems and has requested hundreds of millions of dollars from the government to develop them. The service is seeking $300 million to develop its so-called Navy laser family of systems and get laser weapons to sea in the near term. These lasers could be used for a variety of different uses, including to shoot down or blind enemy unmanned aerial vehicles. The first weapon in the Navy laser family of systems is what's known as the Surface Navy Laser Weapon System. The Navy announced last month that this 60-kilowatt advanced prototype laser weapon will be installed on as many as 3 destroyers to counter drones and fast inshore attacked craft. For United News International in Washington, D.C., I'm Caitlin Mango. The U.S. Navy's fleet will grow by more than 40 ships over the next 5 years. However, President Donald Trump's 355-ship goal is still a long way off. The Navy's budget office said on February 12th that the service will add 46 new ships over the next half-decade. The U.S. Navy currently has 280 ships in its fleet, but a bevy of new destroyers and littoral combat ships coming down the pipe will push that number to 326 ships by 2023. However, growth will slow down significantly after that point. Rear Admiral Brian Luther, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Budget, said the Navy is not on track to reach the goal of 355 ships until the 2050s. In addition, the Navy plans to have more ships out to sea at any given time. The plan is to increase deployed hulls by as much as 30%. For United News International in Washington, D.C., I'm Caitlin Mango.
U.S. forces reportedly killed scores of Russian contract soldiers in Syria. Bloomberg, citing U.S. and Russian sources, reported February 13th up to 200 contract soldiers died in an attack on a U.S. Kurdish military base. Bloomberg says most of the contract soldiers were Russians. However, citing local sources, CNN says most of the casualties were members of a local Christian militia. The Russians involved were reportedly working for a private Russian company called Wagner, fighting on behalf of the Russian and Syrian militaries. The attack happened on February 7th, about 8 kilometers east of the Euphrates River. No casualties were reported on the coalition side, consisting of U.S. forces and Kurdish fighters, mostly with the Syrian Democratic Forces. The Washington Post reports Russia denied any involvement with the attack. U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis said the U.S. is unsure about Russia's potential involvement in the attack. For United News International, I'm Kimberly.
When it comes to North Korea, it would appear that there are some new diplomatic opportunities now that the North is participating in the Winter Olympics. But many world leaders are standing firm that the regime still needs to feel maximum pressure to denuclearize. President Trump and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe have agreed to continue that pressure until they see a result. Park Ki-jun has the details.
In a phone conversation Wednesday, U.S. President Donald Trump and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe agreed to continue putting maximum pressure on North Korea until it agrees to give up its nuclear program. During the hour-long conversation, they also discussed the importance of joint military exercises by the U.S. and South Korea, which are scheduled to start in April once the Olympics are over. And on the same day, U.S. Vice President Mike Pence made similar remarks concerning North Korea. Speaking with Axios, an online news outlet, he said the United States is open to talks with North Korea, but only if it abandons its nuclear ambitions. Pence said the U.S. will continue to intensify its sanctions on the regime and will not lift them until the North starts that process.
North Korea must completely, verifiably, and permanently abandon its nuclear weapons program and its ballistic missile programs. And when that commences, then and only then can we consider any change in posture by the United States or the international community.
He also explained why he did not confront North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, at the Winter Olympics opening ceremony.
I didn't believe it was proper for the United States of America to give any countenance or attention in that forum to someone who's not merely the sister of the dictator, but is the leader of the propaganda effort.
Pence said another reason he ignored the sister was the regime's violations of human rights, such as its political prisons and Kim Jong-un's killing of his relatives. Park Hee-jun, Arirang News.
I'm listening.
A police officer went to check on a burglary victim and ended up putting on a concert. Officer Craig Bull of the Mansfield Police in the UK says he and his partner went to visit a 93-year-old man whose home was broken into earlier in the week. The man lived alone, having lost his wife a few years ago. The officer noticed he had a piano with music open to a Chopin piece that was a favorite of his own grandmother. The man invited Bull to play. The elderly man's spirits were visibly lifted hearing the piano come to life. Bull said seeing his reaction made him feel good about the job he does, knowing simple acts like this can make people feel less lonely in the world.